25 years I drove a taxi through the same city in the same seat with the same ache in my lower back that never once got better. 25 years of other people's conversations in my back seat, breakups, business deals, drunk confessions at 2 in the morning to a stranger they'd never see again. I always told myself none of that mattered because I had something waiting for me at the end of every shift, a boy at home who was going to be somebody. I got him there. He became a lawyer, top of his class if you want to know. And on the one day I had been driving toward for 25 years, the day he put on that black gown and walked across a stage, I wasn't in the room. Nobody told me it was happening. My own son didn't tell me his graduation date. I found out from a photograph on the internet 3 days after it happened. I want to take you back to where this actually starts because the ending doesn't mean anything without it. I came to this country with a taxi license from another life and about $400 folded in my shoe because I didn't trust banks yet and I didn't trust hotel safes either. My wife had died 2 years before we left. It was just me and my son Marcus, who was 7 years old and didn't understand why we were leaving everything he knew. I remember the first night I picked up my hack license. I sat in that driver's seat in a rental lot, engine off, just staring at the wheel thinking, this is it, this is the tool. Whatever Marcus becomes, it gets built through this wheel 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. I wasn't wrong. For 25 years I drove. Airport runs at 4 in the morning. Bar closings at 2. Drunk businessmen who tipped in 20s and drunk businessmen who threw up in my back seat and didn't tip at all. I drove through blizzards because a fare was a fare. I drove with a fever once for 11 hours because rent was due in 4 days and I was $40 short. You learn to read a city from behind a wheel in a way nobody else does. You learn which neighborhoods smell like fear at night and which ones smell like money. You learn that rich people don't make eye contact in the rearview mirror and poor people always do because poor people know what it's like to be looked through. I never wanted Marcus to be looked through. Marcus was quiet, methodical, the kind of kid who read the instructions before touching anything. Teachers loved him. I loved him more than the instructions could ever explain. By the time he was in 8th grade, a guidance counselor pulled me aside after a parent night and told me, "Your son has one of the sharpest analytical minds I've seen in this school." I didn't fully understand the compliment at the time. I just knew it meant something big, and I went home and I made a decision the same way I imagine other men decide to build a house brick by brick, with no shortcuts allowed. Law school, that was the word that started showing up. Marcus wanted to be a lawyer, specifically the kind that argued in front of juries, the kind he'd seen on television as a boy, standing tall in a suit, commanding a room the way nobody in a cab ever gets to command anything. I told him, whatever it costs, we will find it. I want to be honest, I didn't fully understand what it would cost. Undergraduate, LSAT prep courses that ran $600 a session. Application fees that were $80, $90 each, and he applied to 11 schools because a good lawyer, he told me, hedges his bets. Then law school itself, the kind of number that made me sit in my taxi alone in a parking lot for 20 minutes just breathing. So I added shifts. I dropped from 6 days to 7. I started taking the overnight airport runs nobody else wanted because the fares were bigger and the tips were better if you didn't mind sleeping in 3-hour chunks between rides. I sold the one thing of value I had left from my old life, my father's watch, gold, given to him by his own father. A man offered me $6,000 for it outside a pawn shop on a Tuesday, and I sat in my car afterward and cried for the first time in 11 years, not because of the watch but because I finally understood I would give away every single thing I owned, one piece at a time, and never once regret it. I missed Marcus's high school graduation for a 12-hour double shift. I told him I was sick. He believed me because I had never once given him a reason not to believe me. I sat in my cab that night, parked outside the school in the very last row of the parking lot, and I watched the ceremony lights through the gymnasium windows from 400 feet away. I couldn't hear a word of it, but I saw him walk. I saw the shape of him in a cap and gown from a distance, alone in a car that smelled like 25 years of strangers. He never knew I was there. Law school pulled him further than any drive ever could. It wasn't cruelty, I want to be fair about that. It was momentum, the kind of forward motion that happens to ambitious young people when the world finally starts opening doors for them and they stop looking back to see who's still standing at the one they walked through first. He made friends whose fathers were judges, whose fathers had offices with their names on frosted glass doors, whose fathers picked them up from school in cars that didn't have a taxi light on the roof. I never once resented those friendships. I wanted Marcus in rooms like that. That was the entire point of the wheel, the watch, the overnight shifts. But I noticed slowly, the way you notice a headlight going dim over months instead of all at once, that Marcus stopped mentioning me the way he used to. In his study group, in his internship applications, in conversations with new friends, I became at best my dad, delivered quickly without detail, the way you'd mention a fact you didn't want anyone to ask a follow-up question about. He got an internship at a firm downtown, the kind with a lobby made of marble and elevators that required a badge. I picked him up from that internship exactly once in my cab because his car was in the shop. He asked me to park around the corner, not in front. Around the corner so his colleagues leaving the building wouldn't see the taxi light on the roof. I didn't say anything. I drove around the corner. I told myself it was practical traffic, maybe, or a loading zone. I have never fully convinced myself of that. He passed the bar exam 18 months ago. I found out from a text message. 3 words, pass the bar. I called him immediately, and he was in the middle of a celebration dinner with people whose names I didn't recognize, and he talked to me for 90 seconds before he had to go. I sat in my cab in the taxi stand outside the airport that night between fares, and I let myself feel proud anyway. 90 seconds was still something. I told myself that a lot in those years. 90 seconds was still something. Here's the part you need to sit with, because everything before this was just the road getting us here. Law school graduation isn't undergraduate graduation. It's smaller, more exclusive, tickets are limited, families are seated by name. I knew this because Marcus had explained it to me 2 years earlier, back when he still explained things to me. I assumed, the way a father assumes air will be there when he breathes, that he would tell me the date. He didn't. I found out 3 days after it happened. A cousin of mine who follows social media more than I do sent me a photograph. Marcus in his black gown, hood draped over his shoulders in the color of his law school, standing between 2 people I recognized instantly because I had seen photographs of them before in Marcus's apartment, his girlfriend's parents. Her father a retired judge, her mother in pearls, beaming. There was no photograph of me anywhere in that gallery because I hadn't been there, because nobody had told me it was happening. I called him. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set the phone down on the passenger seat and put him on speaker because I couldn't hold it steady. Marcus, I said, I saw the photos from graduation. There was a long pause, the kind of pause that already tells you the answer before anyone speaks. Dad, he started. It got complicated. Rachel's parents were handling the guest list for the reception after, and there were only so many seats, and I didn't want it to be weird with. He stopped himself, but I finished it in my head the way you finish a sentence you already know by heart because you've been afraid of it for years. With you there in a cab driver's jacket, next to a retired judge in a 3-piece suit. 25 years, I said. My voice didn't shake anymore. It went very quiet and very still, the way it does right before I make a decision I know I won't take back. 25 years behind that wheel, every hour of it was for that stage you walked across, and you let a guest list decide I wasn't allowed to see it. Dad, that's not fair, it wasn't like that. Then tell me what it was like, Marcus, because from where I'm sitting in the exact same seat I've sat in for 25 years, it looks exactly like that. I hung up the phone. I didn't cry. I picked up a fare 40 minutes later and drove her to the airport and said nothing the entire ride, and she tipped me $8 and told me to have a nice day, and I said thank you because that's the job. The job doesn't stop for a broken heart, it never has. 3 weeks passed, no call. I want you to understand what 3 weeks of silence feels like when the person going silent is the entire reason you did anything with the last 25 years of your life. Then, on a Tuesday night, my phone rang, and it wasn't a call. It was a video call, which we'd never once done in his entire life, and when I answered, Marcus was standing outside my building on the sidewalk, phone in one hand. Let me up, he said, please. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where I used to do the family finances on the backs of old fare receipts, and he didn't defend himself right away. He just sat there for a long time, and then he said the thing I think he'd been avoiding saying to himself for 3 weeks, let alone to me. I was ashamed, he said. Not of you, I need you to understand that. I was ashamed of myself for being someone who could think even for 1 second that a taxi wasn't good enough to sit next to a judge, and once I realized that's what I'd actually done, I didn't know how to face you because facing you meant facing that. I let him sit in that silence for a moment before I answered, because I'd earned the right to make him wait. I never once needed you to be ashamed on my behalf, I said. I needed you to be proud on mine. There's a difference, Marcus, and it took me 3 weeks to figure out how to say it without breaking. He put his head down on that kitchen table and he cried the way I hadn't seen him cry since he was 7 years old, in an airport, holding my hand, not understanding why we were leaving the only country he'd ever known. I let him cry, then I told him about the parking lot. His high school graduation 400 feet away, watching gymnasium lights through a windshield because I couldn't afford to lose a 12-hour shift. He didn't know that story, 25 years, and he never knew that story. It's been 8 months since that night at the kitchen table. Marcus works at a different firm now, smaller, but his name is on the letterhead, which is something the old firm never offered him. He tells people unprompted now that his father drove a taxi for 25 years to put him through law school. He doesn't say it quietly anymore. He says it the way you'd say something you're proud of, because somewhere between that kitchen table and today, he decided that's exactly what it is. 2 months ago, he asked me to be his date to a bar association dinner. Black tie. I told him I didn't own a tuxedo, and he showed up at my apartment with one already tailored to my measurements because he'd guessed my size from memory, the way a son who's paying attention finally starts to do. I met Rachel's father that night, the retired judge. I shook his hand, and Marcus, standing right beside me, said, "This is my father. He drove a cab for 25 years so I could be standing here tonight." Not my dad, not quietly my father. The judge shook my hand a second time, longer than the first, and said something I've thought about every day since. That's the hardest law degree in this room, and you didn't even have to sit the bar for it. I don't drive as much anymore. My knees finally gave me permission to slow down. But some Sunday afternoons I still take the cab out, not for fares, just to drive the old routes past the school where I watched a gymnasium from 400 feet away, past the marble lobby where a son once asked me to park around the corner. I don't drive those routes with anger anymore. I drive them because I like remembering the wheel that built a lawyer, one shift at a time, even during the years it felt like nobody would ever know. If you've ever given everything you had to build someone else's future and felt invisible standing at the edge of it, I want you to hear what I finally understood. The debt doesn't disappear just because it goes unseen for a while. It waits, and sometimes the people we build with our own two hands need to see themselves clearly before they can finally see us. This has been The Unseen Debt. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments, is there someone who built your future quietly from the driver's seat of your life and never once asked for the credit? We'll be back next week with another story someone needed to finally tell.